to the situation in Türkiye and Syria now after those two massive earthquakes. 11,000 people we now know have lost their lives. James Denselow is head of conflict and humanitarian at the organisation Save the Children, one of the groups trying to do what they can to help people there. James, good afternoon to you. So many people have now died in those two countries. I presume that children now are particularly vulnerable.
Yes, you're right. Children who are trapped in the rubble are particularly vulnerable, especially younger children, especially children in Syria who may be suffering from malnutrition and the effects of a 12-year conflict. They have different skeletal frameworks and muscular resilience and ability to survive in these conditions. But it's beyond the rescue phase that we are particularly concerned with. This has affected so many millions of people, including millions of children, in a particularly inhospitable time of the year, and people being exposed to minus temperatures and the snow can form all sorts of challenges to life and limb. So it's the ability now in this first 48 hours or so to quickly ramp up in southern Turkey and more importantly perhaps in northwestern Syria, where aid has been constricted and constrained for several years.
Very difficult to get aid into both these areas, but in Syria in particular, there are sanctions, Western sanctions. Is this a moment to lift those sanctions? Very difficult decision because of the Syrian government.
Well, the issue actually is not just around sanctions. That is an issue. The issue is around cross-border aid. Syria has the only globally mandated, UN-mandated cross-border operations from Turkey over the last few years. But that has been constricted. It's gone from 4 crossings to 1, and that one has to be renewed every 6 months. So a population that is made up of people who have been displaced several times across Syria during that decade-plus conflict find themselves in northwest Syria in a place where buildings are of low quality. And, of course, let's not forget that 3/4 of those killed in earthquakes are killed by buildings collapsing. So, yes, this is a chance, I think, to look again at making sure that aid is not politicized and can get to whoever needs it as quickly as possible.
You make the point that children are vulnerable from rubble, from a collapsing building. They also become vulnerable because what tends to happen after these disasters, we've seen it in other places, is that there are soon going to be shortages of food and water, and particularly water. That makes the situation very difficult for children.
Indeed, and I was actually again looking at some of the trends and feedback from our team in northern Syria, and we've obviously had a cholera outbreak in that part of the country recently. And as soon as electricity supplies are disrupted and water supplies are disrupted, waterborne diseases can appear that can affect far more people, unfortunately, than the earthquake would do, but in a far more insidious manner. So yes, there's the urgent need to have children who are currently reportedly sleeping in cars and are worried about going back into buildings that may collapse at any time. These children need to have winterization kits. They need to have tents that can look after them. They need to have mattresses, blankets, hot food. And that's just the first step. The next step, of course, is to think beyond that about restarting education, looking after their needs in the longer term, because even though we're a few days into this crisis, the repercussions of it will last for years.
Your resources, I presume, are going to be quite stretched. I mean, you'll have some food stockpiled. You'll be able to move some of it. But you're probably going to need help from people in other countries. You're probably going to need people to give a bit more to your organisation.
And this comes against the backdrop of a dire humanitarian situation in the Horn of Africa, in Afghanistan. We're almost a year into the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. So we are facing a sort of polycrisis at this time. And of course, southern Turkey was the entry point for much of the aid into northern Syria over the last few years. And now that is a disaster zone in and of itself. So yes, we are hugely strained, and this is not something that Save the Children can respond to by themselves. And thankfully, we are seeing a huge response from the international community, certainly in Turkey, as well as Turkish civil society. But as I say, northwestern Syria is, from what I'm seeing, a very different story so far more isolated, not getting the support it needs. And that is a matter of critical concern.
Is there any estimate at this stage, James, of how many children are going to need help? I know coming up with numbers in a developing situation is probably impossible.
It is very difficult. I mean, the numbers, even if you look at the numbers of those who have reportedly died, it jumps exponentially. The WHO warned yesterday the number would top 20,000. I suspect it would be even higher than that from what I'm seeing. So it is very difficult to get a breakdown of age in terms of children who've been affected. We have a rough sense of 1.4 million children we're focusing on, those who are most vulnerable, those who most need our help. There's also obviously terrible issues around children who lose their family or become separated, and lots of child protection concerns for these, especially younger children turning up at displacement centres. So this is a very, very difficult time for the children of this part of the world, and we should all be doing our best for them.
James Denselow, thank you, Head of Conflict and Humanitarian at the organisation Save the Children.